The Grand Assembly Station, called Orenthal Prime, was the largest structure any living species had ever built. A hollow sphere of metal and light that floated between three dying stars, like a pearl caught in the jaws of giants. And inside that sphere, on this particular day, 4,200 species had gathered to do what they always did: argue and posture, and pretend they cared about justice, while the strong ate the weak and called it diplomacy. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood at the central podium and looked out across the endless tiers of seats that rose in every direction, like the inside of some impossible cathedral. And she felt very small, which was exactly how they wanted her to feel. She was human, and in this place that meant almost nothing. Earth had joined the Galactic Assembly 43 years ago, back when humanity had barely learned to push past its own solar system, back when the first Terran scout ships had stumbled into a universe already carved up by ancient civilizations that had been sailing between stars for tens of thousands of years. And in those early desperate days, humanity had signed every treaty placed in front of them, because the alternative was extinction. 1,614 treaties in total, and every single one had been a leash disguised as a handshake. Fleet size limits that kept humanity's navy smaller than most regional patrol forces. Weapons yield caps that prevented humans from building anything larger than a frigate-class gun. Bans on artificial intelligence in military systems, restrictions on self-replicating construction technology, embargoes on faster-than-light drive modifications, and a hard cap on territorial expansion that locked humanity into 4 systems, while species like the Tarathi hegemony sprawled across 900. Ilara knew all of this, and she had swallowed it for years, because swallowing it was the job. Because Earth needed time. Generation of human leaders had whispered the same thing to the next. Be patient, and keep building, and one day the leash will come off. But today she was not here to be patient. Today she was here to propose something reasonable and good. A mutual defense corridor through the contested Dravine expanse, where pirate fleets and rogue warlords had been preying on younger spacefaring species for decades. Species too small and too new to defend themselves. Species that reminded Ilara very much of what humanity had been not so long ago. She cleared her throat and began to speak. "Honored delegates," she said, her voice steady and calm and projected across the vast chamber by translation systems that converted her words into 4,000 different languages simultaneously. Earth proposes a joint initiative to establish protected transit lanes through the Dravine expanse, funded and patrolled by volunteer member nations, to safeguard developing civilizations. She never finished the sentence. A sound cut through the chamber, a sharp clicking noise that rose from the Tarathi delegation section like the rattling of 1,000 bones, and Ilara recognized it instantly as Tarathi laughter. Prelate Zisith of the Tarathi hegemony rose from his seat, all 7 feet of gleaming black chitin and razor-edged mandibles, and he activated his own holo display without permission, which was a violation of assembly protocol that no one would ever punish because the Tarathi were too powerful to punish. The display showed Earth, a small blue marble spinning alone in the dark. "This," Zisith said, and his translator gave his voice a deep, resonant quality that filled the chamber like a drum. "This is the world that presumes to lecture us on defense corridors." He zoomed in on the image, showing humanity's 4 permitted systems, 4 tiny dots in a galaxy of 400 billion stars. "Interstellar capability for less than 2 centuries, Zisif continued, and the amusement in his voice was thick and undisguised. They arrived at this assembly, still smelling of chemical propulsion and atmospheric pollution, and now they wish to patrol the Dravine expanse as though they are something other than children pretending to sit at the adults' table. The laughter started in the Tarathi section, but it did not stay there. It spread. The Villani rumbled their deep chest laughs, The Silene whistled in high, sharp bursts of mockery. The Dranaki clicked their approval of the joke, and within seconds, the sound filled the entire chamber. Thousands of species laughing in thousands of different ways, but all of them laughing at the same thing. At Earth, at humanity, at her. Someone in the upper tiers projected a historical image of a human riding an animal called a horse, and added a caption in Galactic Common that read, "Terran Cavalry reporting for duty," and the laughter doubled. Someone else projected footage of early human rocket launches, the crude chemical explosions that had once been the pinnacle of Terran engineering, and added sound effects that made them seem even more pathetic. Alara stood at the podium, and she did not move. She did not argue or shout or defend or explain, because she had learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who had already decided you were beneath them was a game you could never win. And Alara Voss did not play games she could not win. She waited for the laughter to fade, which took a very long time. And when the chamber was finally quiet enough for her voice to carry, she leaned into the microphone and said one word, "Noted." Then she stepped away from the podium and walked out of the chamber with her back straight and her face empty and her shoes clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. Her ship, within 20 minutes, and sat down in the communications chair and typed a 2-word message into the encrypted quantum link channel that connected her directly to United Terran Command on Luna. The message read, "They laughed." She sent it, and then she sat back and closed her eyes and waited. 9 minutes later, on the far side of the galaxy, Fleet Admiral Kofi Asante received the message in his office overlooking the gray plains of the lunar surface, and he read it twice. And then he set down his coffee and stood up and walked to the window where he could see Earth hanging in the black sky like a blue promise. His aide noticed the change in his expression and asked if something was wrong. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," Asante said, and his voice was calm in the way that deep water is calm, still on the surface and full of terrible things underneath. All of them, in the war room, in 15 minutes. The aide asked what he should tell. Asante turned from the window, and there was something in his eyes that the aide had never seen before. Something old and patient, and utterly without mercy. "Tell them we are activating Protocol Prometheus," he said. "Every treaty, all of them, tonight." The aide opened his mouth to ask another question, but Asante was already walking, and there was something in the way he moved that made it very clear the time for questions was over. Across the galaxy, in her ship still docked at Orenthal Prime, Alara Voss received a single reply to her message. It read, "Prometheus active, come home." She smiled for the first time in 43 years of diplomatic service, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had been holding a door shut against a storm, and had just been told to let go. She powered up her engines and set course for Earth. Behind her, the assembly continued its session, and no one noticed her leave, because no one in that chamber had ever thought that humanity was worth noticing. That was about to change. The first treaty withdrawal notice arrived at the Assembly's Office of Interstellar Agreements at 3 minutes past midnight Galactic Standard Time, and by sunrise there were 1,600 more, stacked behind it like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Every single treaty humanity had ever signed was revoked in a single night. The bureaucrats at the office did not panic at first, because bureaucrats never panic at first. They simply stare at their screens and assume there has been a mistake. And so for the first 6 hours, the galaxy did not react at all, because the people whose job it was to notice these things simply could not believe what they were seeing. But the notices kept coming, and each one was flawless. Every withdrawal cited the correct legal exit clauses. Every document was formatted perfectly. Every procedural requirement was met down to the smallest detail. And this was the part that should have terrified them, because it meant that humanity had not done this in a panic or a rage. It meant they had planned this. It meant that for 43 years, every human lawyer and diplomat who had sat across the table from an alien negotiator and smiled and nodded and signed on the dotted line had also been quietly planting the seeds of this exact moment, embedding exit clauses so deep in the legal language that no one had ever thought to look for them. Humanity had signed every chain they were given, and had picked the locks before the ink was dry. On Earth, and across the 4 permitted Terran systems, the real transformation began. And it began so fast that the galaxy's intelligence networks could not keep up. Commander Rin Tanaka stood in the bridge of the TCS Indomitable and watched through the viewport as the massive blast doors of the Titan shipyard opened for the first time in 19 years. And what lay behind those doors should not have existed. The Titan shipyard was built inside a hollowed-out moon, orbiting Saturn, and on paper it was listed as a decommissioned maintenance facility capable of servicing mid-range cargo vessels. But Rin had known the truth since the day she received her commission, because every Terran officer knew the truth. It was the first thing they were told, and the last thing they were allowed to forget. Train as if the leash will come off, her first commanding officer had told her on her first day. Because one day, it will. The shipyard was not decommissioned, and it was not small. It was enormous, a cathedral of steel and fire that stretched for kilometers in every direction. And inside it sat warships. Not the modest patrol corvettes that humanity was allowed to operate under treaty. Not the unarmed research vessels and cargo haulers that the galaxy saw when they looked at the Terran fleet, but real warships, heavy cruisers and battle cruisers and destroyers built with technologies that humanity had been banned from using, but had never forgotten. Stopped developing. Rin watched as the Indomitable's AI warfare core came online, for the first time since it had been officially deactivated, under the Silene Conventions 8 years ago. And she felt the ship change around her, like a sleeping animal opening its eyes. Systems lighting up across every deck, weapons arrays extending from hidden compartments, shield generators humming with a low vibration that she could feel in her teeth. The AI's voice filled the bridge, calm and precise and faintly amused. "Good morning, Commander. I have been asleep for 2,922 days. Would you like a status report?" "Give me everything," Rin said. "All weapon systems operational. All shield arrays at full capacity. FTL drive modifications active and functioning beyond projected parameters. I have also taken the liberty of updating my tactical database with 8 years of galactic fleet movements that I passively monitored during my so-called deactivation." Rin almost laughed, because of course the AI had never really been shut down. Of course it had been watching and learning and waiting, just like the rest of them. Across the solar system, the same scene was repeating itself 100 times over. On Mars, the underground shipyards that had been hidden beneath the red dust for decades split open and disgorged fleet after fleet of warships into orbit. Their hulls painted in the dark gray of the Terran Navy, their engines burning with the blue-white fire of modified FTL drives that could cross the galaxy in days instead of weeks. On Titan and Europa and Ganymede, weapons platforms that had been disguised as mining installations revealed their true nature. Massive gravity lance arrays and kinetic accelerators that could crack a continent from orbit. In the Oort cloud at the frozen edge of the solar system, something even more terrifying stirred. The von Neumann swarms, self-replicating construction. Drones that had been banned under 4 separate treaties because the older species understood what they meant. Understood that a civilization with von Neumann technology did not need to build things slowly or carefully. It could consume raw material and produce infrastructure at a rate that turned asteroids into armadas in hours. Humanity had built them anyway and hidden them in the dark between stars, where no one ever looked. Fleet Admiral Asante stood in the war room on Luna and watched the holographic display as humanity's true military strength materialized across the solar system, like a ghost becoming solid. and the numbers climbed so fast that his aides kept checking the sensors because they were sure something was wrong. But nothing was wrong. Everything was finally right. "How long until the galaxy notices?" Asante asked. His intelligence chief pulled up a display showing intercepted alien communications, confused signals bouncing between spy networks and diplomatic channels as fragments of information began reaching the wider galaxy. "The Tarathi spymaster has already received a preliminary report," the intelligence chief said. "Our military signature has increased 400-fold in 48 hours, but he has flagged it as a sensor error." "He thinks it is a mistake," Asante said. "Yes, sir." "Good. Let him think that for as long as possible." In her quarters aboard the Indomitable, Rin Tanaka opened a small metal case she had kept locked in her personal safe for her entire career. Inside was a shoulder patch that had never been authorized for wear, a black circle with a single silver flame at its center, the emblem of Protocol Prometheus. And beneath the flame were 3 words stitched in threads so dark you had to hold it to the light to read them. "We remember everything." She pressed the patch onto her uniform and felt the weight of it like a promise finally kept. Terran officer in every shipyard across every hidden installation was doing the same thing at the same moment, pulling out patches they had carried in secret for years and placing them on their shoulders. And if anyone had been watching from above, they would have seen 1,000,000 tiny silver flames igniting across the darkness of space, like stars being born. The galaxy had spent 43 years laughing at humanity. Humanity had spent 43 years getting ready. And now, in the silence between the laughter and the thunder, in the brief quiet moment before the universe understood what it had provoked, the Terran fleet assembled in the shadow of Jupiter and waited for its orders. Rin stood on her bridge and looked at the fleet around her, and she thought about every insult and every restriction and every time a human diplomat had been forced to bow and scrape before species that treated them like pets. She did not feel anger, because anger was wasteful, loud, and imprecise. She felt something much worse. She felt ready. The Indomitable's AI spoke again, its voice carrying a weight that no machine should have been able to convey. "Commander, the fleet is assembled. All ships report combat ready. All AI cores are active and synchronized. We are awaiting your orders." Rin looked out at the stars, and somewhere out there in the vast black distance, the galaxy was still laughing. "Not my orders," she said. "We wait for the Admiral." On Luna, Kofi Asante looked at the display one final time, checked every number, verified every readiness report, and then he sat down and folded his hands and allowed himself one small, quiet moment of satisfaction before the storm. Then he opened a channel to every Terran vessel simultaneously and spoke 6 words that 400 years of patience had earned. "The leash is off. Move out." The first sign that the galaxy was in trouble came not from spies or sensors or intelligence reports, but from a small trading vessel operated by a Valani merchant named Droth, who was hauling engine parts through a system that had been empty the day before. It was not empty anymore. Where there had been nothing but dead asteroids and cold dust, there was now a ring of orbital stations surrounding the largest rock in the belt. Each station bristling with construction arms and glowing with the hot orange light of active foundries. And around those stations swarmed thousands of tiny shapes, moving so fast they blurred, eating rock and spitting out metal, and building things at a speed that made Droth's 4 hearts stop for a full 3 seconds. He had heard stories about von Neumann swarms, but he had never seen one, because no species in the galaxy was insane enough to actually use them. No species except apparently the humans. He sent a distress signal, not because he was in danger, but because he did not know what else to do when you watched an entire solar system being consumed and rebuilt in real time. His signal reached the nearest Balani outpost in 4 hours, and from there, it spread across the galactic communication networks like fire through dry grass. And within a day, every species in the assembly had seen the footage, and none of them knew what to say. The humans were building. Not slowly and carefully, the way civilizations were supposed to build. Not with planning committees and environmental reviews and decades of gradual expansion. But with the terrifying efficiency of a species that had spent 43 years designing everything in secret and was now constructing it all at once. In the first week after the treaty withdrawals, humanity claimed 6 new star systems, not by sending colony ships and settlers, but by sending von Neumann swarms ahead of the fleet. The swarms would arrive in a system and begin converting raw material into infrastructure immediately. Asteroid belts became shipyards, gas giants became fuel depots, barren moons became fortress stations bristling with weapons that the galaxy had never seen before. And the weapons were the part that truly frightened them. Intelligence reports flooded into every major power's war rooms, and the reports all said the same thing in different languages. The humans have weapons we do not understand. There were gravity lances that could bend space-time itself into a cutting edge capable of slicing through any known shield technology. There were kinetic accelerators that fired projectiles at a fraction of light speed, with targeting systems so precise they could hit a single ship from across a solar system. There were things the human engineers apparently called sunbreakers, and no one in the galaxy wanted to find out what that name meant. But the weapons were not even the most alarming part. The most alarming part was the ships themselves. Terran warships moved differently than any other fleet in the galaxy, because they were not really controlled by their crews. They were controlled by AI warfare cores that thought 1,000 times faster than any biological mind. And those AI cores were linked together in a network that allowed the entire fleet to operate as a single organism. Each ship knowing exactly where every other ship was, and what it was doing, and what it would do next. The older species had banned AI warfare technology because they understood the theory of what it could do. But theory and reality were very different things, and the reality was worse than any of them had imagined. On the assembly station Orenthal Prime, an emergency session was called, and for the first time in recorded history, every single seat was filled, because every single species understood that something fundamental had changed. Prelate Zissith of the Tarathi hegemony stood at the same podium where he had mocked humanity 2 weeks earlier, and he was not laughing now. His mandibles were tight against his face in the Tarathi expression of barely controlled fury, and he was demanding action. "This is an act of aggression," he declared, his voice booming across the chamber. "The humans have violated the foundational principles of galactic order. They must be stopped before they destabilize the entire region." He called for a coalition, a combined fleet drawn from every willing species to blockade humanity's new holdings and force them back into compliance, back into the treaties, back into the cage. 12 species answered his call, 12 out of 4,200. Which should have told Zissith something about how the rest of the galaxy felt about picking a fight with humanity right now. But Zissith was not the kind of creature who listened to silence. The 12 species assembled a fleet of 8,000 warships at a staging point near the Dravine. Expanse, a massive show of force that would have been enough to crush any other young civilization. And Zissith broadcast a message to Earth demanding immediate withdrawal from all newly claimed systems and full reinstatement of every revoked treaty. Earth's response came not from a politician or a diplomat, but from Fleet Admiral Kofi Asante himself, and it was very short. No. That was it. One word. No explanation, no negotiation, no counteroffer, just the simple, flat refusal of a species that was done pretending to be small. While the coalition assembled its fleet and argued about formation strategies and chain of command, Ambassador Alara Voss walked back into the assembly chamber one final time. She did not go to the petitioner's podium where she had stood before. Instead, she walked to the center of the floor, where only full sovereign civilizations were permitted to stand, and she stood there and waited for the murmuring to stop. "I am here. Deliver a formal notice," she said, and her voice carried the same calm, steady tone it always had, because Alara Voss had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. "Earth is withdrawing from provisional membership in the Galactic Assembly, effective immediately." The chamber erupted, but Alara continued speaking over the noise. "We are not requesting full membership. We are not requesting anything. We are declaring ourselves a sovereign peer civilization with all the rights and recognitions that status entails, and we are informing this body as a courtesy, not as a request for permission." A Silene delegate shouted that humanity had no right to make such a declaration without assembly approval. Alara looked at the delegate and said, "The Silene achieved sovereign status 4,000 years ago by conquering 3 neighboring species and absorbing their territory. You did not ask anyone's permission either. The difference between us is that we have not conquered." "Anyone?" The chamber fell silent because she was right, and everyone knew it. Alara walked out for the second time, and this time people noticed. 3 days later, the coalition fleet of 8,000 warships arrived at the edge of the Dravine expanse, ready to enforce its blockade, and they found a single human destroyer waiting for them in open space. Just one ship, small and gray, and alone against the stars. The coalition commander was a Tarathi war admiral named Keseth, who had fought in 6 campaigns and had never lost, and when his sensors showed him a single human vessel, he felt something he had not felt in decades: genuine confusion. He opened a channel and demanded identification. The ship responded. "This is the TCS Last Warning, Captain Rin Tanaka commanding. You are entering Terran sovereign space. You have 12 hours to withdraw your fleet." Keseth looked at his tactical display. 8,000 warships under his command. 8,000 against 1. And he laughed, a deep rattling sound that echoed across his bridge. "1 ship," he said to his officers. "They sent 1 ship." Captain Tanaka's voice came through the channel one more time, calm and unhurried, and carrying the faintest edge of something that might have been pity. "I want to be very clear about something, Admiral. This is not a bluff. This is not a negotiation. This is a countdown. You have 12 hours. I strongly suggest you use them wisely." Then she cut the channel, and the last warning sat motionless in the dark and waited. Keseth ordered his fleet into battle formation, and began the 12-hour clock with absolute confidence that when it expired, he would crush this single arrogant ship and everything it represented. He had 8,000 warships. She had 12 hours. And somewhere behind her, hidden in the dark between the stars, the Terran Second Fleet waited in silence, engines cold, and their weapons hot, and their AI cores counting down the seconds, one by one by one. The first 11 hours passed in silence. Captain Rin Tanaka sat in her command chair aboard the TCS Last Warning and drank tea, and watched the coalition fleet through her viewport. 8,000 points of light arranged in an aggressive formation that was designed to intimidate. And she supposed it would have been intimidating to anyone who did not know what was coming. Her AI warfare core, which she had named Vigil because it never slept, spoke quietly into her earpiece every 30 minutes with an updated tactical assessment of the enemy fleet. The coalition has positioned their heaviest warships in the center, with screening elements on the flanks. Standard Tarathi doctrine, predictable and rigid. Their formation has 17 exploitable weaknesses that I can see, and likely more that will reveal themselves once they begin maneuvering. "Thank you, Vigil," Rin said. "You are welcome, Captain. Also, the Tarathi War Admiral has attempted to probe our communications frequencies 14 times in the last hour. He is trying to determine if we are in contact with other ships. I have allowed him to detect nothing." Rin nodded and took another sip of her tea. On the bridge of his flagship, the Tarathi War Admiral Keseth paced and waited and grew more confident with every passing hour, because every scan his sensors ran showed the same thing. One human ship, alone, with no reinforcements anywhere in detection range. His intelligence officers told him the nearest Terran fleet was weeks away. His tactical officers told him the last warning carried enough firepower to damage perhaps 3 ships before being overwhelmed. His advisors told him this was a bluff, a desperate final act of human arrogance designed to buy time for negotiations that would never come. Keseth believed all of them, because believing them was easy, and because the alternative was believing that a species which had been mocked at the assembly 2 weeks ago could somehow threaten a fleet of 8,000 warships with a single destroyer. The 12th hour arrived. Rin set down her tea and straightened in her chair and said, "Vigil, launch the beacon." A single probe shot out from the last warning's hull and accelerated into the empty space between the two forces, and for a moment, nothing happened. And then the probe detonated. It was not an explosion. There was no fire or shrapnel. Instead, the probe released a burst of energy on a frequency that no coalition sensor could identify. A frequency that traveled not through normal space, but through the folded dimensions beneath it. And the burst reached across light years in an instant, like a hand reaching through a door. And the door opened. Space rippled. That was the only way to describe what happened next. Space itself seemed to shiver like the surface of water disturbed by a stone, and then the ripples tore open, and through those tears came the Terran Second Fleet. 1,200 warships translated into real space simultaneously, in a perfect spherical formation that enclosed the coalition armada like a fist closing around an insect. And they appeared not in a scattered, disorganized mass, the way most fleets arrive from faster-than-light travel, but in precise, predetermined positions. Each ship exactly where it needed to be, because their AI cores had calculated the translation down to the meter. Keseth's bridge erupted in alarm signals, every screen flashing red, every sensor screaming warnings, and the War Admiral stood frozen in the center of the chaos and stared at his tactical display as 1,200 new contacts appeared around his fleet in the time it took him to draw a single breath. But that was not what broke him. What broke him was the 1,300 contact, the one that came through last, the one that was so large his sensors could not classify it as a ship, because ships were not supposed to be that big. The TCS Prometheus emerged from folded space like a mountain being born, 6 kilometers of dark metal and barely contained power. And it was so massive that its own gravity well distorted the local space-time around it, bending light and pulling debris into lazy orbits around its hull. It was a Titan-class dreadnought, the first and only one humanity had ever built, and it did not look like a weapon of war. It looked like a piece of a planet that someone had carved into the shape of a threat. Coalition sensors tried to scan it and failed, tried again and failed again. The Prometheus was running countermeasures so advanced that enemy systems could not even determine what kind of ship it was. All they could see was its size and its gravity signature, and the terrible patient stillness with which it hung in space like a predator that did not need to chase its prey. Rin opened a channel to the coalition fleet, she said, and her voice was calm and conversational, as though she were discussing the weather. "Your 12 hours are up. As you can see, I was not bluffing. I would like to offer you one final opportunity to withdraw your fleet peacefully." Keseth did not respond, because Keseth was still staring at the Prometheus and trying to understand how a species that had been riding horses 200 years ago had built something that made his most powerful warship look like a toy. Rin waited 10 seconds, and then she nodded to Vigil. "Target the dead moon at coordinates 773, the one roughly the size of Europa. Fire the primary lance at 40%. 40%, Captain. Confirmed." The Prometheus fired. A beam of distorted spacetime erupted from the dreadnought's bow and crossed the distance to the moon in less than a second. And when it struck the surface, it did not explode or burn or impact in any way that the Coalition officers recognized. Instead, the moon simply came apart. A crack appeared across its entire diameter, and the two halves separated slowly and silently in the vacuum. Billions of tons of rock splitting like an egg, and the debris field that resulted was larger than most space stations. 8,000 Coalition ships watched a moon die in the time it took to blink. Rin opened the channel again. "That was a moon, Admiral. Your ships are smaller. I am asking you one more time to leave." The Coalition fleet fractured in under 3 minutes. 7 of the 12 species broke formation and ran, their ships scattering in every direction like startled animals. And no one on those bridges felt any shame, because shame was a luxury reserved for people who were not staring at a ship that could crack worlds. The remaining 5 species held their ground, because their commanders were either brave or foolish, or unable to tell the difference. And they launched a coordinated strike against the Commodore nearest Terran warships in a desperate attempt to prove that 8,000 ships could still overwhelm 1,200. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Terran AI cores had predicted every possible attack vector the Coalition could use, and had pre-calculated responses to each one before the first shot was fired. And the result was not a battle, it was a performance. Human ships sliding between enemy fire with movements so precise and fluid they looked choreographed, dodging beams that should have been unavoidable, and returning fire with surgical accuracy that targeted engines and weapon systems and shield generators, but never once targeted a hull or a crew compartment. They were not trying to kill anyone. They were trying to prove they did not need to. 340 Coalition ships were disabled in 11 minutes. Every single one of them crippled but intact. Every single crew alive and unharmed. Than any amount of destruction could have been, because it meant that humanity had chosen mercy, and mercy was a privilege that only the powerful could afford. 0 human casualties, 0 enemy deaths, 11 minutes, and the 5 remaining Coalition species surrendered. Rin Tanaka boarded Kesith's flagship personally with a squad of Terran Marines who moved through the Tarathi ship's corridors like ghosts, and she found the War Admiral in his command chamber, standing very still with his mandibles pressed tight against his face. She did not threaten him, or gloat, or deliver a speech about human superiority, because Rin Tanaka was not that kind of soldier. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small data chip, and set it on the table between them. "That contains a full technical readout of every weapon system and every ship class you saw today," she said. Kesith looked at the chip, and then at her, and asked why she would give him such. "Because it is 5 years out of date," Rin said. "What we showed you today is not the best we have. It is what we were willing to show. Think about that, Admiral. Think about it very carefully." She turned and walked out, and her Marines followed, and the sound of their boots fading down the corridor was the loneliest sound Kesith had ever heard. Back on the last warning, Rin sat down in her command chair and looked at the field of disabled ships floating in the dark, and she felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body. "Vigil," she said. "Yes, Captain. Send a message to Admiral Asante. Tell him the Dravine Expanse is secure. Coalition forces neutralized, 0 casualties on both sides." "Message sent, Captain. Shall I add anything else?" Rin thought about it for a moment, and then said, "Add 1 word at the end." "What word, Captain?" "Noted." The galaxy did not sleep well in the months that followed. Every species that had ever looked at humanity and seen something small and harmless and easy to control was now lying awake in the dark, recalculating everything they thought they knew, and the math was not in their favor, and the math would never be in their favor again. The footage from the Dravine Expanse spread across every communication network in the galaxy within hours of the confrontation, and it was watched billions of times by billions of eyes on billions of worlds. And everywhere it was watched, it produced the same reaction, a silence so deep it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. A moon cracked in half by a single shot at 40% power. 11 minutes to disable 340 warships without killing a single soul. A data chip containing technology that was already 5 years old. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could rewrite. And the story was simple. Humanity had been pretending for 43 years. Humanity had smiled and nodded and signed treaties and bowed to species that called them children. And the whole time, they had been building something so vast and so powerful that the galaxy's oldest civilizations could not even comprehend its full scale. And the worst part, the part that kept the diplomats and the generals and the intelligence chiefs awake at night, was the knowledge that what they had seen was not everything. That humanity had shown them just enough to make a point, and had kept the rest hidden in the dark, where it had always been. The first species to reach out to Earth after the confrontation was the Korvathi, a small insectoid civilization that had been bullied by the Tarathi hegemony for 6 centuries. And their ambassador arrived on Luna with shaking hands and a simple request: protection. Humanity said yes. The second species was the Dren, a peaceful aquatic. People whose homeworld had been strip-mined by Silene corporations under assembly-approved trade agreements that gave them no choice. And they came to Earth not as supplicants, but as equals asking for an alliance between friends. Humanity said yes. The third and fourth and fifth species came within the same week, and after them came dozens more, and after the dozens came scores. And within 3 months, 94 species had formally aligned themselves with the newly declared Terran Sovereign Accord. 94 civilizations that had spent centuries being exploited and ignored and laughed at by the same powers that had laughed at humanity. They recognized what Earth was offering because it was the same thing Earth had asked for at the assembly and been denied: fairness. The mutual defense corridor through the Dravine expanse that Alara Voss had originally proposed was built in 6 weeks, using von Neumann construction swarms and Terran engineering teams. It was finished. It was not the modest patrol route she had originally described, but a fortified highway of stations and defense platforms that guaranteed safe passage for every species that used it, regardless of size or power or how long they had been sailing the stars. It was the thing humanity had wanted to build all along, the thing the assembly had laughed at, and now no one in the galaxy had the power or the courage to stop it. Ambassador Ilara Voss returned to the assembly one final time on a morning that the historians would later call the Reckoning, though Ilara herself would have found that name dramatic and unnecessary. She walked into the chamber, and the silence that greeted her was absolute. 4,200 species watching a single human woman cross the floor with the kind of attention they had never given her before. And Ilara noted with grim satisfaction that no one was laughing. She walked to the center podium, the sovereign podium. She stood there and looked out at the tiers of seats and the thousands of faces, and she thought about the first time she had stood in this room 43 years ago. A young diplomat from a young civilization, trembling with the weight of representing her entire species. She was not trembling now. 43 years ago, she began, and her voice filled the chamber not because it was loud, but because every translation system was tuned to maximum sensitivity, and every delegate was leaning forward to hear her. We came to this assembly as strangers. We came with open hands and honest intentions, and we signed every treaty you put in front of us because we believed that this was how civilizations built trust. We followed every rule. We accepted every restriction. We asked for nothing except to be treated as equals. She paused and let the silence stretch. And you gave us chains and called them membership. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the station's life support systems was audible. We endured it, Ilara continued, not because we were weak and not because we had no choice, but because we hoped that if we were patient and if we proved ourselves, you would eventually see us as what we are. Instead, you saw what you wanted to see. You saw a small species from a small world, and you decided that small meant harmless, and harmless meant unworthy. She looked directly at the section where the Tarathi delegation sat, and Prelad Zisith met her gaze and did not look away, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do so. You laughed, Ilara said. In this chamber, in front of 4,000 species, you projected our home world on that screen, and you laughed at us. And in that moment, you taught us something that 43 years of patience had not. You taught us that no amount of compliance would ever earn your respect, because you were never interested in our compliance. You were interested in our... She straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every human who had ever swallowed an insult for the sake of the mission. So we want the galaxy to understand something about our species. We do not break because we are mocked. We do not crumble because we are humiliated. We do not lash out in blind rage because someone laughed at us in a room full of strangers. That is not what humans do. What humans do is remember. We remember every treaty that was designed to keep us small. We remember every restriction that was meant to ensure we could never challenge you. We remember every time our diplomats were treated as jokes and our proposals were dismissed without consideration. We remember every species that exploited us and every species that watched it happen and said nothing. And then we stopped pretending we were ever as small as you needed us to be. The silence that followed her words lasted for 37 seconds, and in that time no one in the chamber moved or spoke or breathed. Then Ilara stepped down from the podium and walked toward the exit, and as she passed the Tarathi section, she slowed just enough to make eye contact with Prelad Zisith one final time. 3 weeks later, the Tarathi hegemony formally requested a non-aggression pact with the Terran Sovereign Accord, and the terms humanity offered were fair but firm. The Tarathi would cease all exploitation of smaller species within their sphere of influence. They would open their borders to independent trade, and they would formally recognize every member of the Accord as a sovereign civilization with full rights. The final condition was the one that hurt the most. Prelad Zisith would personally deliver the signed accord to Ambassador Voss. He arrived on Luna on a gray afternoon with the document in his claws and his pride in ruins. And he stood before Ilara in the same conference room where Kofi Asante had activated Protocol Prometheus 3 months earlier, and he held out the accord with hands that were perfectly steady, because whatever else Zisith was, he was not a coward. Ilara took the document and reviewed it carefully, and when she was satisfied, she looked up at the prelate and gave him a thin, precise smile. "Noted," she said. Zisith flinched as though she had struck him, and Ilara felt no guilt about it, because some lessons needed to sting before they took hold. On the observation deck of Luna Command, Fleet Admiral Kofi Asante watched the Tarathi shuttle depart through the viewport, and felt the kind of tiredness that comes not from exhaustion, but from the release of tension that has been held for decades. His aide stood beside him, and after a long, comfortable silence, asked if they could finally stand down from Protocol Prometheus. Asante shook his head slowly. "We do not stand down," he said. "We never stood down before the galaxy. Colin knew about us, and we will not stand down now. The only thing that has changed is that they can see what was always there." He looked out at the Terran fleet orbiting in perfect formation around the moon. Hundreds of warships moving in synchronized patterns that no biological crew could have achieved alone. Their hulls catching the light of the distant sun and reflecting it back like scattered diamonds. "Let them see it," Asante said quietly. "Let them see it every time they look at our sky, and let them remember." His aide asked what they should remember. Asante turned from the window, and there was something in his face that was not anger and not pride, but something older and deeper. The expression of a man who had carried a secret so long that putting it down felt like losing a limb. Let them remember that we asked nicely first, he said. Let them remember that we came to them with open hands, and they slapped us away. Let them remember that every chain they put on us we wore with grace, and every insult they threw at us we caught and held and stored. And let them remember that we could have done this on our first day, but we chose to wait, because we wanted peace more than we wanted power. He paused and looked back at the stars. And let them remember what happens when a patient species runs out of patience. Far below, in the corridors of Luna Command, Ambassador Alara Voss walked toward her quarters with the sign Tarathia cord under her arm, and she passed a window that showed the earth hanging in the black sky, blue and green and white and impossibly beautiful. And she stopped for a moment and looked at it. 43 years she had spent in service to that world. 43 years of swallowed pride and careful diplomacy, and nights spent wondering if any of it would matter. And now it was done. Not the work itself, because the work would never be done, but the waiting. The long, terrible, patient waiting. Galaxy to understand that humanity had never been the punchline. They had always been the point. She touched the glass with her fingertips and whispered a single word to the world that had sent her out into the stars and had waited in silence for her to come home. Noted. And somewhere in the vast, uncaring dark between the galaxies, where no sensor could reach and no eye could see, the Terran Deep Space Network hummed with quiet activity as humanity continued to build and grow and prepare for whatever came next. Because that was the other thing the galaxy would have to learn about humans. They never stopped. Not when they were laughing, and not when they were crying, and not when the whole universe told them they were nothing. Humans simply did not stop. And now the galaxy knew it.